Can't begin to tell you how moving it is to be here with you this morning. Those of you who are in the sanctuary and those of you who are gathered from afar, it feels profoundly meaningful to be here today. And these are almost all of the mentions of Thomas, by the way. I, as a child in Sunday school, I had to memorize the names of the 12 disciples. Maybe you did too. We, in our case, learned a little song reciting their names and featuring a chorus with the lyric, "He has called us to, He has called us to. We are His disciples, I am one and you." Maybe you learned that one. Half a century later, even with the help of the song, I still don't remember all the disciples' names. But even if I could still rattle off or sing the names of the 12 disciples and a handful of women among Jesus' larger group of disciples, I would still know very little about who they were. The 5 disciples we think of most readily: Simon Peter, Judas Iscariot, James and John, Thomas. We know only by bare anecdotal sketch. And this is appropriate. The Gospels are about Jesus, and the focus is and should be on him. Yet the disciples are inextricable from the Gospel stories. The disciples' devotion, confusion, faults, and doubts provide context and narrative structure to Jesus' teachings and actions. They demonstrate Jesus' ministry in relationship, not just in public. They place us in the story. Some of you may recall I've mentioned Thomas in prior summer sermons. For me, he's an enigma and an alluring one, a man for whom we don't even have a proper name, who's been made into a caricature, but whose recorded actions speak of a certain fearlessness. Thomas is most often referred to as doubting, but that epithet does not come from the scriptures. He's identified in the Gospels as Thomas the twin. This sermon was precipitated by a question I posed to Will earlier this year. Was Thomas actually a twin? And if so, was his twin still alive when Thomas followed Jesus? Twins had an equivocal status in ancient societies, sometimes revered or welcomed as a sign of divine favor, but equally often viewed as ill-omened, even cursed. The story of Esau and Jacob, for example, presents a complex narrative about the nature and relationships of twins. I wondered, what was Thomas' experience, and how did that shape his persona and his discipleship to the Christ? To his credit, or perhaps to your dismay, you may decide, Will suggested I go investigate for myself and report back to you all from this pulpit. Here we are. And here's the short version of what I discovered. No one knows. What we know is simply this: Thomas is a name which means twin. That's pretty much it. Depending on the translation, as we heard this morning, he's referred to as Thomas the twin or Thomas Didymus, Didymus also meaning the twin. So he's identified as the twin, the twin. We have no idea why he has no name of his own, only this double assertion of twinness. However, as I read various biblical commentaries and sermons about Thomas, it became clear to me that this mystery didn't only resonate with me, it obviously resonated with many, many people and inspired widely differing interpretations. The more I read, these interpretations began to resemble the litany of nose insults from Cyrano de Bergerac, or as updated by Steve Martin in his modernized homage, Roxanne. Following the excellent examples of Rostand and Martin, I grouped various commentaries into 6 categories. Factual. Various scholars have taken the literal path and supposed that Thomas was a biological twin, whether of fellow disciples Matthew or Philip, or of a sister, Lydia, or some other unnamed person, either living or deceased. In this interpretation, his twinness marks him out as someone who is defined by reference to a sibling. Notably, if he was the twin of either Matthew or Philip, neither of them bears the twin designation, which would suggest that Thomas would have been the second-born, lesser twin. The remarkable thing about this interpretation is that not only are Thomas, Matthew, and Philip not identified as brothers, Matthew and Philip are barely mentioned except in the roster of disciples Jesus chose. And whoever else might have been the firstborn twin has simply been lost to our knowledge. So if Thomas was literally a twin, the lesser twin became the more prominent. That's at least congruent with a through-line theme of the Bible, Esau and Jacob included. Apocryphal. A few scholars outside the canon have postulated that Thomas was Jesus' birth twin, which raises some obvious scriptural objections. We do know that Joseph and Mary had a natural human family after Jesus' birth. And although I couldn't find any mention of it, it did occur to me that perhaps Aramaic had an idiomatic expression equivalent to the latter-day slur Irish twins, referring to siblings born within a year of each other. However, since there's no scriptural reference connecting Thomas to Mary and Joseph, this seems like an unlikely stretch. Descriptive. Other scholars have supposed that Thomas closely resembled someone else, whether one of the disciples, another unnamed person, or perhaps Jesus himself. Here, Thomas is so named because he looked like someone else, who was again more significant or more important than he was. In this interpretation, he's the doppelganger, the double, the duplicate, the spare. A kinder interpretation, which I did not encounter, might be that Thomas was a ringer, but a better version of another person, well known in Jesus' time, perhaps someone powerful or feared, along the lines of he who must not be named. There isn't any scriptural basis either to support or dismiss this interpretation. So, maybe? Jocular. A couple of scholars noted that in any social group, nicknames arise from ribbing, gentle or not so gentle mockery of striking physical attributes or personality quirks. Here the interpretation is that our mystery disciple was tagged the twin because of a changeable nature or quick temperament. This view casts Thomas as notable for abrupt shifts from one emotional state to another. But if any of the disciples might be called out for that attribute, wouldn't Simon Peter be an equal or better candidate? Metaphorical. In a similar vein, other scholars posited that Thomas is his own twin. He carries within him a dualistic nature which is divided against itself, containing opposing internal impulses of unbelief and faith, incredulity and allegiance, devotion and isolation. Again, however, this doesn't really distinguish Thomas from any of the other disciples, who as a group evince wildly divergent states of conviction and despair, awe and pettiness, devotion and panic. Sentimental. Finally, I found at least one source proposing that Jesus named Thomas to signify deep, singular affection. Thomas as Jesus' other self, the heart of his heart. This endearment interpretation really sings to me, but runs up against passages in John referring to the disciple Jesus loved, who does not appear to be Thomas. So appealing though it is, it seems dubious. Across these and probably several other categories, the twins' recorded deeds and statements are interpreted again and again as indicative of a man who was incomplete, conflicted, or a shadow. One who was with Jesus and yet questioned, among the 12, yet did not find comfort in their community. Like Cyrano, whose mind, heart, and soul were obscured to all those who could only see his oversized nose. What I see differs from so many of these learned commentaries of biblical scholars and millennia of pastoral teachings. What I see when I read the few mentions of the twin is his willingness to put himself in harm's way, whether physical or social, to be with Jesus. When Jesus insisted that he would return to Judea, where religious officials sought to kill him, the twin determined that if Jesus would not be dissuaded, then at least he and the others could go die with him. When Jesus told the disciples they knew the way to where he was going, the twin was the one who was unafraid to look foolish in naming his bafflement and ask Jesus to give explicit directions. Following Jesus' death, the twin declined the false security of hiding with the rest in a locked room, tempting the same grisly death Jesus prayed to avoid, and all the disciples fled. Perhaps he craved solitude just as Jesus so often did, or sought Jesus' memory in the isolation of wandering among the throng and crush of the city. I also see an unwillingness to accept easy consolation. Any of you who have been plunged into grief at the death of someone you love dearly may have experienced the desperate pull of the bereaved heart to see the loved one out of the corner of your eye, across the street, in a crowd, in the distance, in the doorway. There is a momentary lift of joy and a flood of relief in the fleeting illusion that perhaps it has all been a terrible mistake and the beloved is alive after all. The twin refused to allow himself to entertain this magical thinking. Finally, I see a fervent desire to believe all that Jesus had said and done and been to him. When Jesus invited the twin to touch him, to feel his violated but living body, the twin showed no hesitation and exuberantly declared his joy and praise. I love the twin for what I see of him in these scant anecdotes. Perhaps it should come as no surprise that the more that I contemplated the gospel anecdotes about the twin, the more I came to appreciate how providentially apropos is this morning's lectionary reading from Psalm 34, offering an ancient parallel between the psalmist and the twin. I sought the Lord, and he answered me and delivered me from all my fears. Look to him and be radiant, so your faces shall never be ashamed. This poor soul cried and was heard by the Lord and was saved from every trouble. This psalm feels perfectly characteristic for the twin, testifying to being embraced by Jesus, his soul's cries repeatedly answered with love. Moreover, there are several ancient and traditional accounts of the twin traveling across India and even into China, preaching the gospel and founding churches late into the 1st century. He's reported to have died a martyr in India and is widely venerated by both Christians and Muslims there as the father of the church in the subcontinent. So, gathering these many fragmentary and refractory impressions together, please allow me to offer a 7th category of interpretation for the twin: prophetic. I propose to you that Jesus named our mystery disciple, the twin, prophetically, In the same way, he christened Simon Peter prophetically. Simon's birth name is recorded to emphasize that he was the rock on which Jesus chose to found his church, not because of who he was before meeting Jesus, but because of who he became after following Jesus. I suggest to you this morning that Thomas' name represents an even more intimate and existential dedication. The twin carries no pre-christening name, because in this case, it would be a distraction. Jesus named him the twin, everyone's twin, our twin, with all the ambivalence that entailed in the ancient world, in the millennia since, and ever into the future, and all that inspires in our individual and collective hearts. Our twin reflects back to us the full spectrum of our real and projected fears and prejudices, our bafflement, grief, despair, courage, adoration, ecstatic faith, ministry. In him, we later disciples are quick to dismiss a person acknowledged only in reference to someone else, or an externally imposed idea, not meriting a distinct or complete identity. In him, we castigate our shadow self, the impolitic one we would condemn, ridicule, condescend to, or put aside. In him, we condemn our self-contradictory attributes and impulses, conflicted, changeable, and inconstant. We cast him as the self-exiled outsider, even within Jesus' chosen inner circle. Yet we also admire his bravery. We regard him as Jesus' counterpart or complement. We envision him as the beloved platonic matching piece to Jesus' heart, as a full sibling to the Christ. We celebrate him as a saint. If we can accept this prophetic interpretation of the disciple named the twin, our twin, can we also see him? Can we see ourselves as courageous and heartbroken, doubting yet devoted, chosen and known and heard and dearly loved by God, specifically for ourselves, and unselfconsciously radiating that love to all we meet? Can we recognize ourselves as his twin? May it be so.
Amen.